Oh, we had a good time on the last lecture talking about video cameras. And today we're going to add to that good time, i.e. that technical stuff, by talking about lenses. We're going to discuss the ability for the camera to accept light through the lens, how we can control what the image looks like using the lens, and as I've said over and over again, it's all about control. How we can use the lens to our advantage to make the pictures look absolutely fantastic. So let's get right to it. We're going to talk about these lenses. There are two types of lenses that we're going to discuss. The first one is called a prime lens. With a prime lens, you've got a fixed focal length. What does fixed focal length mean, Dave? It means you cannot zoom. You are not able to zoom with a prime lens. The nice thing about a prime lens is you have better light transmission. The issue is that because you cannot zoom, they're not very common in television. Why bring them up, Dave? Well, because they're available, they're out there, and some people are purists and they like to use these prime lenses. Not me. I prefer the zoom lenses. Zoom lenses, of course, by definition, have a variable focal length, which means they zoom. We're going to talk about what a focal length is during this next lecture. There are various categories of zoom lenses that we're going to talk about. Let's get right to these categories. The first one is we can differentiate zoom lenses by either studio or field lenses. A studio lens generally is longer, generally kind of almost box-shaped, and a field lens would look something more like this particular lens. This is a lens that came off of one of the field cameras. The front of the lens is here. You may recognize it from the front of any video camera. The back of the lens is here, and this is where it would be shown, or it would be attached to, I guess. Shown's not a very good word at all, but it would be attached to a camera. Let's go ahead and get a close-up of this, JR, and I'll talk about the different components of a lens. First of all, we've got a number of rings on a lens. This one at the front of the lens, that's furthest away from the camera, if it were to be attached to a camera, is called the focus ring. The focus ring allows us to focus the lens. The next ring in is called the zoom ring. I'm going to go ahead and make it so it'll spin freely. This is the zoom ring. As we move this ring, the lens would zoom in and out. The third ring that moves is the iris. The iris has markings on it which show the f-stop. We're going to talk about what all these things mean in just a second. But we've got the focus ring, we've got the zoom ring, we've got the iris ring. On this particular lens, inside this box, is a what's called an extender, which magnifies the lens times 2, and we can flip a lever down like that, which would increase the magnification of the lens by 2. It would double the magnification of the lens. That's what the extender does, or the 2x extender as it's sometimes called. And then the ring nearest to the camera is called the macro ring, and it also allows for adjustment of what's called back focus. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. This last ring here on the very end is actually what locks the lens to the camera. This is not a ring that you want to spin unless you're intending to take the lens off the camera. We'll talk about what all of these rings mean, what all of these elements mean in just a second. But we've got the focus ring, the zoom ring, the iris, the extender, the macro or the back focus, and then the attachment ring. Up on top here we have control of the zoom. It's a servo-controlled or assisted zoom, which allows you to zoom the lens in and out with a motor helping you. There are other switches here which we're not going to talk about during this lecture. We'll talk about in a future class, I'm sure. So what do these things mean? Well, we're going to talk about these in just a second. But let's get back to the graphics, this studio versus field lens. So we have the studio lens, which is large. We have the field lens, which is generally small. Studio lens generally has shorter focal lengths, and by definition, the studio lens is used in the studio. I know that makes sense, right? But shorter focal lengths because in the studio you don't have to zoom very much. There we go, used in the studio. It's as if I knew it was coming. Used in the studio. Then we contrast that with field lenses, which are longer focal lengths. Now, Dave, what does this thing called focal length mean? This is the amount of zoom in the lens. The shorter the focal length, the less the zoom of the lens, the less it can zoom in. The longer the focal length, the more it can zoom in. So a field lens will generally have longer focal lengths, and by definition, geez, these are really good definitions, they're used outside of the studio. We can also differentiate lenses. So we've talked about studio versus field. We can also differentiate a lens by its zoom range. For example, a 10x or a 10 by or a 40x or a 40 by, however you want to say that. Most people would say 10x or 40x. That's the magnification or the zoom range. So if you had some specific starting point, then a 10x would do 10 times that amount of zoom. A 40x or a 40 by would go 40 times that amount of zoom. So we can categorize studio versus field, zoom range. We can also categorize by lens format. I talked on the last lecture about the size of the imaging chip in a camera, the CCD, or the charge coupled device. 2/3 inch or 1/2 inch. 2/3 inch being larger than a 1/2 inch would be a higher quality camera, but you could have lenses that are differentiated by the size of that imaging chip or CCD. I will tell you that's not very common at all in television production. You generally will see studio versus field, and even well common would be that magnification factor, that 10x, 40x, and so forth. We're going to move on now to the optical characteristics of lenses. That first one is focal length. And I told you, as promised, that I would tell you what this was all about. Focal length, the amount of zoom in the lens. It's going to be expressed in millimeters, expressed in millimeters. So you'll have something like 8 millimeters or 120 millimeters, something like that. That refers to the focal length, which is essentially the zoom of the lens. The lower the numbers, the lower the focal length, the wider the lens is. The larger the numbers, the more telephoto the lens is. Telephoto is a fancy word for zoomed in. My kids love Fancy Nancy, right? Telephoto is a fancy word for zoomed in. All right, cool, yeah. So here, 28 millimeters, you can see that this is a lens that is zoomed out. 70 millimeters, a lens that is more zoomed in. And 210 millimeters, even more zoomed in. You can see it's the same image, just zoomed in more. As we increase the number of millimeters on the focal length, we make the lens more zoomed in. Let's demonstrate this here in the studio. So JR has a nice wide shot. Let's open that lens all the way up. Let's go as wide as it can go. I'm not sure how many millimeters that is on there. I don't know if you can even see in the dark, but it's going to be a nice low number. It's going to be maybe something like 12 or 20, something like that. He's looking. Can't really see it. I'm sure it's too dark. But let's go ahead and zoom the lens in now. We're going to increase the focal length of the lens. And by increasing the focal length of the lens, we could go crazy and we could go extreme close-up right on my face. Yeah, look at that good-looking guy. A nice high focal length. Maybe that would be something like 150 millimeters is what he's telling me. So 150 millimeters on the zoomed in portion, nice high number. And as he zooms all the way out, he'll be able to look at the focal length of the lens as it's zoomed all the way out. And we're going to find that it's a lot less. 75, he tells me. Was it? 7.5. I was going to say, that sounds kind of high, but that's what I get for not hearing very well. 7.5 millimeters on the wide side, 150 millimeters on the zoomed in side. So you can see as a studio lens that's being used here in the studio, and any lens for that matter, the lower the focal length of the lens, the wider the shot, and vice versa. So that's focal length. Let's look at the sharpness or blurriness of the image. This is focus. I had my 11th grade video production teacher at Hurricane High School that said, David, you need to focus. You need to focus. The thing, and he would always say it with his eyes like this, David, you need to focus. Reminded me of John Houseman. Anyway, he always was telling me to focus, and the thing is, I've picked it up as an adult. He wasn't necessarily meaning I need to make the picture less blurry. I needed to actually focus because I had a hard time focusing back then. I was kind of, I don't know, kind of a bad student, I guess you could say. But focus is the sharpness or blurriness of the image. I put those two in quotation marks because it's kind of subjective. In fact, I'm sure that as you look at these two images, as this video is being streamed, you probably can't even tell a difference between those two, because it's difficult for me to show you something that's blurry when you're looking at video that's been compressed for streaming so that you can see it on canvas. But out of focus is a term we use sometimes in the television industry, but you'll more often hear it referred to as soft. So you might hear something like, camera 3, you're soft. JR, you're soft. Something like that. What they're telling you is it's out of focus. It is out of focus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite JR to go ahead and zoom in, give me maybe, I don't know, a medium close-up, something like that. I'm going to turn nice profile, right? Let's go ahead and make it nice and soft. He's going to spin that ring out. Now you may be able to see it. Let's zoom in even a little bit more. It'll even get a lot worse. There we go. So we can see I'm nice and blurry or soft. So Corey in the control room might say, hey, JR, camera 1's soft. He's yelling it right now. He's soft. Yep, so JR now will pull focus. Pull focus. And what pull focus means is you're going to zoom the lens all the way in. You're going to get rid of the softness. You'll make it nice and sharp. And then as JR pulls out to a wider shot, it will remain in focus. Now that's dependent on one thing that we're going to talk about in just a second. But generally, when you're working a camera, if you zoom in all the way, focus, and then zoom out to a shot that's pulling focus, you'll find it to remain in focus. And a lot of times you can't tell if something's out of focus unless it's zoomed in all the way. So if JR spins the focus ring just a little bit, you may look and say, well, Dave looks absolutely fantastic as usual. He's nice and sharp. He's not even out of focus. But notice how when JR zoomed in, it got more out of focus. It got more blurry. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second. But you can see he's able to pull focus, and as he zooms out, I remain perfectly in focus. If he were to zoom all the way in again, I would remain in focus as long as he didn't adjust the focus ring or I moved further away from the camera. Notice as I move further away from the camera, I go soft again. So he can focus now. As I move closer to the camera, notice that it goes soft again. So focus is dependent on the camera and the subject remaining the same distance from each other. If the subject gets closer to the camera or vice versa, or the camera gets closer to the subject or vice versa, further away, then the image will go soft again. That's something you need to keep in mind as an operator. All right, let's move on back to the graphics. More optical characteristics. I mentioned to you that as long as we focus, pull focus, we should remain in focus unless the subject gets closer to the camera or further away. That is dependent on the back focus of the lens being set correctly. The back focus of the lens is set when the lens is placed on the camera. It's also set at the beginning of every shoot. You verify that when you zoom in on something, pull focus, and then zoom out, that thing remains in focus. This is paramount. It's required. It's very, very important. Otherwise, you'll end up with soft images as a camera operator, and you'll have no idea why. It's the back focus that needs to be adjusted. This is something I'll tell you about in this lecture, but I'll need to demonstrate how to adjust the back focus in a lab. So for now, we're only just going to show it. There's also the macro of the lens. The macro allows very close detail work. So if I was to move really, really close to this camera right here, yeah, whoa, there I am. I can't even see myself. I can't see the program monitor from here, but I'm probably even a little bit dark, I'm sure. But if I was to move really, really close to the lens, it's probably going to go soft no matter what. JR can spin that focus ring all he wants, and it'll get to a point where I'm too close to the lens for him to be able to focus it. But the lens would have a macro control on it. I'm not going to have him adjust the macro because it's too difficult to adjust. But by adjusting the macro, you're able to get things really, really close to the lens so that they can be highly magnified but still remain in focus. So that's another thing I'll have to demonstrate for you in the lab. We're not going to talk about in the lecture. We'll just talk about it in the lecture, but I won't show you how to do it. All right, back to those graphics. When you have the macro adjusted, you can no longer zoom and have the image remain in focus. If you really want to know the back focus and the macro, if you're adjusting those on the lens, and as I showed you on that lens that I was demonstrating for you, there is the adjustment. In fact, I'll show it to you again. Jar, let's get a nice tight shot of that again. This ring right here that's nearest to the camera, that's not the actual lock, if you look, it actually says macro on it. It's probably hard to read, I'm sure. This ring, as we adjust the macro, is also, if I was to adjust the back focus, notice it is the exact same ring. The back focus and the macro are the same ring. So if we're adjusting the macro, we wouldn't be able to zoom and have the image remain in focus because that back focus control is what allows for the lens to remain in focus when it's being zoomed. Maybe that doesn't make perfect sense. It requires a demonstration. All right, let's get back to those graphics. Back focus and the macro. So if you're using the macro, you're not going to be able to zoom. All right, what's that extender? I showed it to you on that lens a little earlier. The extender, it will multiply the focal length of the lens. So if it's a 2x extender or 2x, you'll double the focal length of the lens. So on our studio lenses, we had 7.5 millimeters on the short end or the wide angle. If we had the 2x extender engaged, it would be 15 millimeters. On the more telephoto or the zoomed in side of that lens that JR showed us, it was 150 millimeters. If the 2x extender was engaged, it would be 300 millimeters. So the range would be 15 millimeters to 300 millimeters. And it would not be able to be changed live because the extender really messes up the image while it's being engaged. So that's elements of focus. We've got back focus, we've got macro, we've got the extender. The extender is more having to do with focal length, which is measured in millimeters. Nice review. All right, we must now move on to this thing called the iris. You've probably heard we have irises in our eyes. What are these things called irises? Let's get some text up here. We've got 3 words that are common to each other. They are all describing essentially the same thing, but they use different terms. They kind of mean the same thing. They're related, but they're specific to different things. What do you mean, Dave? Just get right to it. All right, the iris. The iris is the name of the mechanical device that controls the amount of light that passes through the lens. So this whole thing right here, the whole mechanism right here, is called an iris. It is the mechanical device, the actual thing inside the lens that controls the amount of light passing through the lens. Then we have the aperture. The aperture is literally the hole that is created by the iris. So this right here, the hole that is created by the aperture, by the iris, is called the aperture. The hole created by the iris. Wow, there's the rest of that sentence. It's the hole created by the iris. All right, so we have the iris and the aperture. The iris is the mechanical device. The aperture is the hole. Let's talk about the f-stop. The f-stop is a numerical representation of the amount of light passing through the lens. You can think of it as the setting of the iris, the width or openness of the aperture. So as we change the f-stop, we're changing the iris, we're increasing or decreasing the aperture. Those are how those terms are related to one another. The f-stop is generally, you'll hear numbers like these. In fact, a lot like these. You'll hear these most common. These are common f-stops. 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22, 32. If you start here, get these first 2 numbers. Wait, Dave, you want us to memorize these? Yeah, I want you to know what these numbers are. Yep, so let's start here. We'll make it easy. Start here with 2. Remember these first two. 2, 2.8. If you've got those two, you're going to be well on your way to getting the rest. Because if you skip one and go to the next one, you're basically doubling that number. So 2, then 2.8, and then the next number is twice what 2 was, and it's 4. 2.8 becomes 5.6, and then 4 becomes 8. It's kind of like leapfrog, right? 5.6 becomes 11. It kind of breaks down there a little bit. 8 becomes 16, 11 becomes 22, 16 becomes 32. So if you get 2 and 2.8, you can generally get the others. 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22, 32. Now, I don't necessarily want you to memorize those exact numbers, but I want you to be able to recognize that those are f-stops. Now, what do we mean by these things? First of all, I will tell you, the numbers, the f-stop numbers, it doesn't matter the size of the lens. If it's a wide lens, if it's a long lens, if it's a telephoto lens, it doesn't matter at all. The f-stop numbers represent the amount of light going through the lens. So in other words, if you had one lens that was set for 5.6 on the f-stop, and you changed to a different lens, you would adjust that to 5.6, and you would see the same amount of light going through the lens. That's the f-stop. This is where it's important. In order to open the iris, in other words, make that mechanical device more open, we're going to lower the f-stop. What this will do is allow more light to pass through the lens. So let me get back to this mechanical device, this image of the iris. All right, here we have the iris. The hole created by the iris is the aperture. If we want to increase the amount of light going through the lens, we need to make the aperture larger, which means we need to open the iris. By opening the iris, we increase the aperture. More light is able to come through the lens. If you can imagine, the hole is where the light goes through. The aperture, if it's larger, more light goes through. The iris is open, the aperture is larger, more light gets through. That is a lower f-stop. Lower f-stop means the iris is opening, or more open, the aperture is larger, more light is getting through the lens. So let me get back to the text-based version of that now. The more open the iris, the lower the f-stop, the more light gets through the lens. So if you can imagine these numbers here, 2 all the way up to 32, the numbers that are lower mean the iris is more open, means that more light is getting through the lens. Why does this matter? Well, this is all about proper exposure. We want to make sure that what looks good in real life looks good on television. So we'll need to adjust the iris by changing the f-stop and affecting the amount of light getting through the lens. All right, so let me show you on this lens again. I'm going to show you that iris ring again. And here we go. Yeah, perfect. Do I need to come a little closer maybe? I'm going to come a little closer. And I'll hold it as steady as I can. This right here is the iris ring. Notice the markings on the iris. There's no 2, it's actually 1.7. But 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and the last one is C. C stands for closed. So you can imagine as we lower the f-stop, the iris is opening. As we increase the f-stop, the iris is closing until we get to that C where the iris is completely closed. The aperture is as closed, it's basically, there's no aperture. There's no hole for any light to get through. As we open the iris, we increase the amount of light getting into the lens, getting to the imaging device of that camera. All right, so you can see on that iris, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6. Yeah, on that particular lens it was marked as 1.7 instead of 2, but hey, I was close. All right, if that's difficult for you, I understand. It's been difficult for students in the past. It requires a demonstration. We will get to that in the lab. Let's move on in the lecture, though. We're going to discuss depth of field. Depth of field is easy. This one's a cinch. Look at this. All right. The subject at distance s is in focus at image distance v. Point objects as distances d of f and d of n would be in focus at image distances v of f and v of n, respectively. At image distance v, they are imaged as blur spots. The depth of field is controlled by the aperture stop diameter d. When the blur spot diameter is equal to the acceptable circle of confusion c, the near and far limits of depth of field are at d of f and d of n. I think that's what that says, d of n, d of f. Easy. Okay, yeah, I hope everyone's eyes popped out of their heads just barely, because I understand that is not easy whatsoever. Dave, simplify it for us. Use a different slide and simplify it for us, please. Don't copy this down. Maybe you're anxiously writing notes. Don't. Depth of field is simply the distance in front of and behind the focal plane that is acceptably in focus. So here we have a page of text. If we can imagine the focal plane, which is basically what the focus is set at the lens, which would be about right here on this line, the depth of field would be the amount of space, or the distance, from the focal plane that is in front of the focal plane or behind the focal plane that's acceptably in focus. So if we can look at this line of text, we can see that this text, the depth of field width, or whatever that says, is the focal plane. It's what's actually adjusted on the focus ring of that lens. But we can also see that this line is acceptably in focus, this line's acceptably in focus. We can read this other line and this one, but it's too blurry. And if you can't tell on the stream, on the video, on Canvas, it is too blurry to be acceptably in focus. Now that depth of field can change. There are things that can change the amount of space in front of and behind the focal plane. So this depth of field can increase, and we can get more lines of text in focus, or it can decrease to a point where even one line would be in focus and maybe not even that. We can actually get depth of field to a point where my nose, the tip of my nose is in focus, but my eyeballs, that are set back a little bit, are not in focus. Very, very narrow depth of field. Or we can set depth of field so that my entire body plus all of the background is acceptably in focus. We can adjust that depth of field indirectly by changing different characteristics of the lens. Depth of field is dependent on 4 variables, things we have control over. The first one is the focal length of the lens. Now I'm going to tell you about this and then I'm going to demonstrate it. The longer the lens, in other words, the higher the focal length, or the more zoomed in the lens, the less depth of field. This one affects depth of field the most. So what we're going to do, JR, is I'm going to have you nice and zoomed out for me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stand right about where this bush is here. Notice, if you can, maybe you can't tell on the stream on Canvas, you may or may not, but my face, as well as this plant that's behind me, is acceptably in focus because the lens focal length is at its lowest setting, 7.5 millimeters on this particular lens. Now, I'm going to have JR go ahead and zoom in right on my face. I'm going to look at the program monitor. Go ahead and do it fast. You're good. All right. Now, pull focus on my face. And let's pan it to the right just a little bit so we can see the bush. The other right. Yep, there we go. Notice now the bush that is right here is out of focus. Now, JR, slowly zoom out, nice and slowly. Notice as he zooms out, the bush that's behind me starts to become in focus. And he's not changing the focal plane. He's not changing the focus ring on the lens. All he's doing is zooming the lens. As we decrease the focal length, as he zooms out, we are increasing depth of field. So even though he's focused right now on where my nose was at the time, the focal plane is not changing, but the depth of field is increasing and it's getting larger. As he zooms in, it'll have the opposite effect. The depth of field will decrease to a point where the bush is not acceptably in focus anymore. It gets to a point where it's in fact completely blurry, to a point where it's worthless. Wow, my skin looks good. Okay, yeah, that's another thing. All right, so that's depth of field. Being affected by the focal length of the lens. Let's get back to those graphics. Another thing that can affect depth of field is the f-stop, or the setting of the iris, the size of the aperture, the amount of light getting through the lens. The lower the f-stop, the lower the number of the f-stop, the less depth of field. As you will recall, when we talked about f-stops just a moment ago, the lower the f-stop, the more light is getting through the lens. When we increase the amount of light getting through the lens by lowering the f-stop, by opening the iris, by increasing the aperture, those are all just different ways of saying the same thing, we will get less depth of field. One thing that is interesting about this particular one, when you're shooting outside, like a sports game, football game, something like that, as a camera operator, as the sun goes down, the amount of light that's available to us is decreasing. And so in the truck or in the trailer, they are opening the irises using the CCU. So you as the camera operator, you're not adjusting the iris, you're not opening the iris, they're doing it for you in the truck. But what that's doing is, it is decreasing the depth of field. So as a camera operator, what you'll find is, as the sun goes down and they're opening those irises for you, you have less depth of field. As the night goes on, as the sun goes down, it becomes more difficult to keep things in focus because there's less depth of field allowing you to keep things acceptably in focus. So that's one thing that's interesting for you. The other thing is as you're shooting things outside, let's say you're shooting something for a specific program, as you're setting up a camera, you may want to have the background completely out of focus, completely soft. To do that, you need to have less depth of field. You can do that by zooming the lens in, or by opening the iris. Decreasing the amount of light, open the iris, less depth of field. Holy moly, is that confusing? Confuses me. No, I guess it doesn't confuse me, but it probably confuses you. We have two variables now that we've talked about that affect depth of field. The focal length, or the zoom of the lens, the f-stop, or the amount of light getting through by means of the iris, or the aperture. We can also talk about the subject distance. The closer the subject is to the camera or to the lens, the less depth of field you will have. This one's difficult to demonstrate here in the studio, and also it affects depth of field the least, and so I'm not going to concentrate a whole lot of time on it. The fourth one is also something that's very difficult to change. That's the CCD size, the size of the imaging chip on the camera. It's really difficult to change that. You basically have to get a new camera, bring a new camera in. But the larger the chip, the less depth of field you'll have. That's why more professional cameras with the 2/3 inch size CCD chips, as compared to the consumer ones with 1/3 inch CCD chips, the professional ones will have less depth of field, comparatively speaking. But these two are generally the most difficult to change, and this one in particular, subject distance, affects depth of field the least. And so you'll find zooming the lens and adjusting the iris will give you as much control over depth of field as you would ever want. As I said, this is the most difficult to change. All right, so here's a couple of pictures of depth of field. We can see the image on the left has the most depth of field. We've got the flowers in focus. We've got the background, the grass is also in focus. With this one here on the right, we've got less depth of field. The flowers are in focus, but the plants, the background, the grass, I should say, is out of focus. You can see what controlling depth of field does. You can notice on this image on the left that the flowers kind of blend in with the grass. It's kind of more difficult to differentiate them. With less depth of field, those flowers kind of stand out. They pop out. And you can see how you as a camera operator can control your subject and what your viewer is concentrating on. With this, they're more distracted. With this, you're focusing their attention right there on those flowers. All right. How do we get less depth of field? Well, we zoom the lens. We talked about pulling focus, didn't we? You zoom the lens in all the way, you focus, and then you zoom out to pull up a shot. Now you know why we zoom all the way in. Because as we zoom that lens all the way in, we are decreasing depth of field the most. It becomes its narrowest. By decreasing that depth of field and then pulling focus, changing our focus, as we zoom out and increase now depth of field, all we're going to do is make it so that our subject is continuously nice and in focus. That's why when we pull focus, we zoom all the way in. We're decreasing depth of field, then we're focusing, then when we pull out, we're increasing depth of field, our subject is going to remain in focus. So, zoom in to decrease depth of field. We can also open the iris. I'm sorry. How do we get less depth of field? Oh, there we go. I'm like, what am I thinking here, Dave? Yep, less light. So we can decrease the amount of light in the room. By decreasing the amount of light in the room, we must open the iris to compensate, to get a proper exposure, proper aperture setting. This will decrease depth of field. A lot of people will be confused and they'll say, well, you can change depth of field by lowering the lights in the room. And that's not true. The only thing that affects depth of field in this case is the smaller f-stop, the more open iris. By decreasing the amount of light, you're making it so that the iris has to be more open, so you're decreasing depth of field. You can zoom in, you can decrease the amount of light in the room. This will cause a decrease in depth of field as you adjust. In order to do this, you can also use the shutter. We talked about the shutter on the camera in the last lecture. The shutter decreases the exposure time of each frame of the video camera that it's reproducing. As you decrease the exposure time, you have to have more light getting to the imaging chip, i.e., you have to open the iris. Then you decrease depth of field. So as you increase the shutter speed, you make it more like 1/1000th of a second or 1/2000th of a second. To compensate, you must let more light through the lens. You will do a smaller f-stop, a more open iris, then less depth of field. There we go. Faster shutter speed equals less light getting to the imaging chip equals a smaller f-stop in order to let more light into the lens to compensate, and less depth of field. Holy moly. Was that not the most technical lecture we've had yet? That one was crazy. I got some pictures to show you now. That'll help. We're done with the technical aspect of today's lecture. Let's talk about some pictures. Lenses work differently than your eyes. Lenses can zoom in. They can be telephoto, but they also will distort things. And I have some pictures for you, some pretty pictures. Here's one. Oh, that looks so nice. It's a nice landscape. What a wide-angle lens will do when you have a nice low focal length, a nice wide lens, you'll get what's called foreground magnification. If you can see on this, the rocks are magnified as compared to the rest of the scenery. It may not be completely noticeable in this picture, but what about this one? Yeah, foreground magnification. Notice that this gentleman is magnified. He actually appears to be larger. Same with the horse. Look at the size of that horse. Geesh. Have you ever heard people say, well, the camera adds 10 pounds? Well, I'll tell you what, the camera can add 10 pounds, but it's not the camera doing it, it's the lens. If the lens is wide, you're going to get foreground magnification, which makes people look fatter. Yeah, I look kind of, do I look about, oh, no, I look a lot better than him. I'm just saying that for my own self-confidence. Yeah, but the camera can add 10 pounds. It's not the camera, it's actually the lens doing that. The other thing is you'll have, with wide-angle lenses, you'll have edge distortion. Notice on the edges of this image, especially on this woman's face, you can see her face is it almost appears to be warped to the edges. That is edge distortion, and it's common when you're using a wide-angle lens. In fact, if this image were to be panning, you would actually see her face go from being distorted to being not distorted as she got closer to the middle, and then as she got closer to the other end, it would become more distorted on the way out. Here's a linear perspective, another wide-angle distortion. We can see linear perspective as these lines are converging in here. We can also see this collie right here, this dog, appears to have like legs that are like 10 feet long. She's got monster legs, or he, I don't know, he or she on that dog has monster legs. So linear perspective will be distorted in wide angle lenses. And of course, there you go, fat face. We get a distortion where things look fatter. Look at the bill of the hat, sheesh. Huge, the same kind of wide angle distortion. You can emphasize the foreground. There's another version with the dog. With the wide angle lens, you can say, hey, this is what I want you to look at. Is this thing right in the middle? And so forth. So those are wide angle distortions with wide angle lenses. Now, if we have telephoto or narrow angle distortions, as the lens is zoomed in, you'll get what's called compression. Compression is where the foreground and the background seem to be closer together than they are. So these pillars in this image, they appear to be closer to each other than they are in reality. It may be difficult for us to gauge the distance from this pillar to this pillar and so forth, but this could be 100 feet. But as we've zoomed the lens in, it seems to bring the foreground and the background closer together. Same thing is true in this one. So how much of the freeway are we actually looking at here? Is this maybe 3 miles, maybe 1 mile? It's difficult for us to say because as the lens is zoomed in, we're constricting, we're compressing the foreground and the background. We're actually able to see a lot more, but the distance is difficult to gauge. All right, wow, that was it. We got through a lot of stuff today, didn't we? A lot of technical things. I understand lenses are quite technical. It's a lot like the last lecture with video cameras. We've got a lot of technical aspects going on. But when we control the video camera, its color, when we control the lens, we know how to adjust depth of field. We know how to adjust for nice, good-looking pictures. When we control for those things, we show how professional we can be. We're able to control the user, the viewer. We're able to control what they look at as we force them to look at specific things because we have controlled depth of field and other things, color and stuff like that. We've talked a lot about lens theory today. I know a lot of this stuff is probably way over the head. If you have questions, do let me know. Shoot me a message as you get them. Ask me when we actually meet for the labs and meet in class. And as always, I'm going to keep on smiling. I hope you do too. I'll see you on the next lecture.